How significant is my life? Do I make a difference? When I move, when I act, when I do something? Does God notice? Do I really matter? In 1963, Edward Lorenzi presented a hypothesis to the New York Academy of Science. His theory, simply stated, was that a butterfly could flap its wings, setting molecules of air in motion, which would then move other molecules of air in motion, in turn moving more molecules of air in motion, eventually capable of starting a hurricane on the other side of the planet. Lorenzi and his ideas were literally laughed out of the conference. What he had proposed was ridiculous. It was preposterous, but it was fascinating. And therefore, because of the idea's charm and intrigue, the so-called butterfly effect became a staple of science fiction, remaining for decades a combination of myth and legend, spread only by comic books and bad movies. So, imagine the scientific community's shock and surprise when suddenly, more than 30 years after the possibility was even introduced, physics professors from colleges and universities worldwide came to the conclusion that the butterfly effect was authentic, accurate, and viable. And soon afterwards, it was accorded to the status of a law, now known as the law of sensitive dependence upon initial condition. This principle has proven to be a force encompassing more than mere butterfly wings. Science has shown the butterfly effect to engage with first of all movement of any form of matter, including people. Well, did you know that there once existed a single man who, more than a century ago, made one move, whose effects still ripple through your lives today? He was a 34-year-old school teacher, but on that hot, humid day of July 2nd, 1863, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was in the fight of his life. A former professor of rhetoric from Bowdoin College, he was now a colonel in the Union Army. Chamberlain stood at the far left edge of a line of a group of 80,000 men strung out across fields and hills, stretching all the way to a little town called Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And earlier that day, a Colonel Vincent had placed Chamberlain and his men of the 20th Maine at the end of the line, saying, "Whatever you do, you can't let them come through here." Joshua could not withdraw, and he knew it. If the Confederate army overran them, the rebels would gain the high ground. In essence, 80,000 men caught from behind on a downhill charge with no protection. They would be caught from behind. But to win, the gray-clad Confederates would have to come through Chamberlain. And it happened. At 2:30 p.m., the first attack came from the 15th and 47th Alabama Regiments. They attacked, running uphill as fast as they could, firing at Chamberlain's men who were stationed behind a rock wall they had thrown up that very morning. The 20th Maine stopped the rebel charge and pushed them back down the slope, only to face a second and then a third charge. But on the fourth assault, Chamberlain was knocked down by a bullet that hit him dead center in the belt buckle. Realizing that I wasn't seriously hurt, Colonel scrambled to his feet, continuing to fight. Again, they halted the enemy's charge, and again they retreated down the hill. At that time in history, battles were fought with artillery and small arms ammunition. The struggles were close, face-to-face affairs. On that fourth charge, the Confederates almost made it to the rock wall, a thigh-high stack of flat rocks that ran almost 110 yards in length. While Chamberlain and his men waited for the next assault, Chamberlain felt sorry for his men. He later recalled, their leader had no real knowledge of warfare tactics. I was only a stubborn man, and that was my greatest advantage in this fight. I had, deep within me, the inability to do nothing. I knew I may die, but I also knew I would not die with a bullet in my back. I would not die in retreat. I am at least like the Apostle Paul, who wrote, "This one thing I do, I press toward the mark." The attack came again, and on this, the fifth charge, the Confederates broke open the stone wall. Without time to reload, the men were swinging their rifles at each other and brawling with fists and knives. Somehow, the 20th Maine pushed the rebels back downhill another time. Then on that fifth broken assault, Chamberlain's younger brother Tom appeared with Sergeant Tozier, an old, hard-nosed soldier. Sergeant Tozier had a thick wad of torn shirt stuck into a hole in his shoulder where he had been wounded. "No help from the 83rd, the sergeant said. They're shot to ribbons and all I can do is extend the line a bit. We're getting murdered on our flank." "Can we extend?" Chamberlain asked. "There's nothing to extend," Tom answered. "More than half our men are down." It was true. Chamberlain started in Bangor, Maine 6 months earlier with 1,000 men. He started that morning with 300, and now he was down to 80. "How are we for ammunition?" Chamberlain asked. "We've been shooting a lot," was his brother's reply. "I know we've been shooting a lot. I want to know how we're holding out. How much ammunition do we have left?" As Tom ran to check, a boy had climbed a tree and yelled, "They're forming up again, Colonel!" He looked up to see the boy pointing downhill. "They're forming up right now! Sir, there's a lot more of them this time!" At that moment, a messenger stumbled into their midst out of breath. He said, "Sir, Colonel Chamberlain, sir, Colonel Vincent is dead." "Are you sure, soldier?" "Yes, sir. You shot right at the first of the fight. They were firmed up by Weed's brigade, but now Weeds is dead. They moved to Hazlitt's battery up top, but Hazlitt is dead too." Chamberlain's younger brother Tom came running back. "Joshua, we're out! 1 to 2 rounds per man at most. Some of the men don't have anything at all." Chamberlain turned to a thin man standing on his right. It was First Sergeant Ellis Spear. "Spear," he ordered, "tell the boys to take the ammunition from the wounded and the dead." "We did that last time, sir," Spear replied. "Maybe we should think about pulling out." Chamberlain responded grimly. "We will not be pulling out, Sergeant. Carry out my orders, please." The Sergeant Tozier interjected, saying, "Colonel, we won't hold them again, sir. You know we won't." And Tom, his brother, keeping an eye on the enemy. "Joshua, here they come! Here they come!" I'm sure you can imagine everything Chamberlain was thinking about. Overwhelmed, I'm sure he was. But Chamberlain went to the top of the wall in full view, crossing his arms and staring down at the advancing enemy. The 15th and 47th Alabama regiments, with their pale yellow-gray uniforms, now reinforced by a Texas regiment, moved up the hill as their high-pitched shriek, the rebel yell, coursed up the hill towards Chamberlain and his men. Chamberlain's younger brother Tom, and Sergeant Tozier, First Lieutenant Spear, and Lieutenant Melcher, the flag bearer, were all huddled below. "Joshua," said his brother, "do something! Give an order!" Chamberlain stood there for a moment, deep in thought, quickly sorting the situation. "We can't retreat," he said, "and we can't stay here. And when I'm faced with the choice of doing nothing or doing something, I will always choose to act." And then, turning his back on the advancing enemy, Chamberlain looked down at his men and said, "Fix bayonets!" At first, no one moved. They just stood there with their mouths open. "Fix your bayonets now," he commanded again. "Execute a great right wheel of the entire regiment. Swing the left first. Do it now." Lieutenant Melcher was the first one to speak, confused. "But sir, what is a great right wheel?" But the colonel already jumped from the wall and was moving to the next group of men. But Sergeant Tozier answered the question. "He means to charge, son. A great right wheel is an all-out charge. And then, turning, Chamberlain pointed his blade directly downhill. And facing overwhelming odds, Chamberlain slashed his blade through the air. And with the power born of courage and fear, the school teacher from Maine roared, "Charge! Charge! Charge!" The remaining 80 fighting men lifted their voices to match that of their leader. "Charge! Charge!" they cried, tumbling over the wall into history about which most people in our country have never heard. For when the Confederates saw Chamberlain, the leader of the opposition, mount the wall, they immediately stopped, unsure of what was happening. And when he pointed his sword directly at them and commanded his men to charge, they turned and ran. Many of them threw down their loaded weapons. The rebels were certain these were not the same men they had been facing. Surely these men had been reinforced. A beaten regiment would not charge. And in less than 5 minutes, Chamberlain had his sword at the collarbone of a Confederate captain. "You, sir, are my prisoner." The man turned around a fully loaded Navy Colt revolver and offered it to Chamberlain. "Yes, sir," he answered, "I am." And in less than 5 minutes, that ragged group of 80 men, under Chamberlain's command, without any ammunition, captured over 400 soldiers of the enemy. It is amazing to contemplate. It's an amazing story, isn't it? And absolutely true. But here's what most people never consider. Historians say that had Chamberlain not charged that day, the South would have won the war, or would have won at Gettysburg first. And further, historians say that had the rebels won at Gettysburg, they would have proceeded to win the war, and the war itself would have been over by the end of that summer. Most people think that had the South won the war, we would live in two countries. We exist as two countries, the Union and the Confederacy. And so historians insist, however, that had the South won the war, we would exist today on a territorially fragmented continent, much like Europe. North America would be divided into 9 to 13 countries, which means when Hitler swept across Europe, had Chamberlain not charged that day so long ago, there would not have existed a United States of America to stand in the breach. And systematically, when the Japanese leader invaded the islands of the South Pacific, there would not have existed a country big enough, strong enough, wealthy enough, and populous enough to fight and win 2 wars on 2 fronts at the same time. America exists as it does today because of a single man, one 34-year-old school teacher, and one move he made more than a century ago. Don't you see? Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is a human example of the butterfly effect. One man who made one move whose effects still ripple through your lives today. And you are no less of an example of the butterfly effect than Chamberlain was. Every single thing you do matters. Not just to you, or your family, or your business, or your hometown. Every single thing you do matters to all of us, forever.